So the question from Twitter is, if the UK leaves, does the UK government see an EEA-style agreement, EES in Norwegian, as a realistic alternative to membership? I think I'll start with you, Ambassador Owen. What are the alternatives to EU membership for Britain?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think it's a question that will continue to evolve really over the next couple of years. Certainly, at the moment, the Prime Minister has been really clear that there is no good alternative on the table at the moment, and the alternatives that Norway and Switzerland have got seem to work quite well for your countries, actually, but we don't think they would work at all well for the UK. And I think it's very difficult for most people in the UK to imagine a situation where we would be, in effect, as David Cameron once said to Prime Minister Stoltenberg, governed by facts from Brussels. That's a very difficult situation to imagine us signing up to. So I think at the moment there are no viable alternatives on the table.
Øivind, do you think that British voters would understand what they're saying yes or no to if they have a referendum?
On the Eurovision Song Contest, that is. No, it's complicated. It's always complicated when you involve the voice of the people, and that is that has an element of unpredictability to it, which also applies to the Scottish independence referendum, by the way, where things are indeed difficult to predict as well as control, because you don't really know what an electoral campaign can bring. So there's an element of unpredictability. But I just wanted to add a couple of reflections to what Petros said about the different key concepts here and the tension between them. And I think it's quite obvious that the idea of competitiveness may fly in the face of democratic accountability as well as flexibility. At least if you see competitiveness in the sense of a shared set of rules and very efficient decision making on behalf of 28 member states, there is a limit to how much flexibility as well as accountability you can permit within such a system. And that also applies to the idea of involving national parliaments more extensively, because as soon as you say that each and every national parliament should be able to have its say and to adjust and revise and raise its yellow and red cards and wave to the audience and all that, you open up for more long-lasting and difficult political decision-making and more extensive processes that are not really what the EU needs if the basic ambition is effectiveness and swift decision-making in that sense. So that's something that is important to remember. And if you look at the EEA agreement within this perspective, it's quite obvious that EES prioritizes competitiveness and efficiency, and to hell with the rest, in a way, which works quite well in economic terms, but is not ideal from other perspectives.
Petros, how do you see a possible referendum?
Well, as I said, I would rather not have one. I'm not a big fan of referendums or referenda. And by the way, there's a huge debate going on in academic circles in the UK whether you can call them referenda in plural or referendums. So you can understand how nerdy we are and how much we focus on the important things here. But I believe that if you really want to engage the electorate in a conversation about what it means to be a member of the European Union, it's an enormously important conversation. But if you really want to engage them, you have to do it at local, national, and European elections. Every time you go on the doorstep and you engage with the citizens, you have to talk to them then. A referendum is a snapshot of history, an opinion poll at one particular moment, which can set the future and the fate of a nation for a generation at least. This is not how you decide important things. You have to have constant debate at every possible opportunity, certainly at every electoral contest. And that's something we haven't had for a while. And my fear is that if we had a referendum, the electorate will respond the way my mother responds when I call her after weeks without having talking to her. She will complain to me about everything. And I fear that the British electorate is so tired of not being entertained with a bit of discussion about the European Union that when they finally get asked the question, they're just going to say the hell with you and the European Union.
We already started to get quite a few wanting to come on the speakers list, and that's a good thing. I've recognized 6 persons, so we start with all in the back.
I think one thing that I appreciate from the British point of view, and which is important for Euro positive people to consider, is joining a club which you cannot exit is not something that everyone supports. And England shows that they're willing to reconsider their position to strengthen their support of the Union, but they also have to have a realistic position where they can pull out. This is important if you're going to be a member of the Union. You can't only join and then you will have to be there forever. That is not a realistic situation.
Okay, so the question is about the need for a realistic opportunity to pull out, and let me address that question to you, Ambassador Owen. Is it a realistic opportunity to really pull out of the European Union for Britain?
Well, I think it's, I think the point is that we're having a realistic debate at the moment, and I think you're quite right that it's important to raise these issues. I think it's been actually quite healthy to raise them in the UK, and it's engendered quite a healthy debate right across Europe, some of which is already raging in many of the other states. I think that it's really important to give the people a choice. I know that having referenda or referendums can be risky, and sometimes having a democratic system is a bit inconvenient and annoying, isn't it? But, that's the nature of democracy, and I don't think we should shy away from that. There's a lot of people in the UK under about 40 years old who would say, we've never had a choice about Europe. The last referendum was a very long time ago, and we want to have a choice. So part of the purpose is to have a sensible debate out there, and I think we're seeing now a lot of these facts and a lot of information coming out, and it is starting to have an impact. And it's not just politicians going around knocking on people's doors, but it's business leaders talking about how things, first of all, talking about the benefits of being in the EU, but then also talking about how we can do things even better. And I think that's a very good situation to be in.
Petros, how do you see it? Is it a sensible, not a sensible, but a realistic option for Britain to pull out?
I just want to touch upon the meaning of the word choice, because the UK is a country that doesn't have referendums as part of its political discourse. In fact, there have only been held 2, as far as I remember, in certain living memory. One on the European Union and one on the alternative vote system. And for that reason, I don't believe that they belong to the political tradition. Not least because we haven't had a referendum about Britain's membership of NATO. We haven't had a referendum about Britain's membership of the UN, the WTO, even UEFA. Should we start, and a lot of people down in Chelsea will argue greatly about the injustice that UEFA did to them a couple of years ago, and they would probably like to leave it. So is this what we're talking about here? Get into a political tradition that allows people the choice and the opportunity to vote on every international organization and every international agreement it engages. And that's just to touch upon the question of having the right to leave the European Union. It is part actually of the treaties now. Member states are able to leave the European Union, and there is a mechanism in place. But the question here is about legal commitments. It's a bit like signing a contract in the business world. Your counterparty expects you to honor that contract for the duration of the contract. You don't often go back and say, you know what, I just realized that the terms are not really to my liking and I want to change them. That is the conversation that, to a large extent, Mr. Cameron is engaging in Brussels. I want to change our relationship here. Even though my predecessor signed up to it, I want to alter it. And I'm not entirely sure that's exactly how you do business.
Øivind, as a non-British and as an analyst, does it seem realistic that Britain should pull out of the European Union?
I think it's a very difficult situation to envisage what will come after, and I'm sure there will be a lot more debate on that over the next couple of years prior to referendum, what the alternative may be. And part of the problem there is that there are conflicting visions around as to what Britain should be, if not part of the European Union. I mean, there are some dreams, or some visions rather, on the right side of the political spectrum concerning a British business model, Britain becoming something of Europe's Singapore, relying upon financial services, global free trade, and being liberated from the heavy-handed European regulation. But that is, these kind of visions are a bit, they need to be substantiated a bit, I think, and discussed a bit more. And it will be difficult to create a political consensus on what Britain should be outside the European Union. And I think it's difficult to agree on what to do inside, but it's also very difficult to agree on what to do outside.
Next question for them.
I noticed conspicuously that at the start of your remarks, Ambassador, you spoke about Britain and about Europe. And the last time I looked at the map, I certainly recognized Britain as part of Europe. And I suppose that is the reason why we're discussing it. The British idea of Europe is a continent apart. My question is related to that. What would the continent apart think about the concessions that the British government or the Conservatives would now like? And Petros, you were alluding to this. All these concessions, they may not be available. And what would Hollande in France and Merkel in Germany and all the other, if we could say so, less prime ministers, what would they say about the flexibility and the competition issues? And I would rather like to have the academic and the ambassador's view on this.
Thank you. So the question is about what kind of concessions one have to accept if one part of a compromise, which the European Union is. Ambassador, what's your reply?
Well, I think these discussions are going on at the moment. But, you know, it's interesting to see that David Cameron and Angela Merkel have been having a lot of debate about this amongst themselves. And I think if you look around the Union, there are quite a lot of countries, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, quite a number on the Eastern European side as well, who support much of what the UK has been advocating. And actually, Prime Minister Letta in Italy has been saying some rather interesting things on that subject as well. So I think the jury is out. It seems to me, and this is a personal view, that the democratic accountability side of what we're looking for is probably the most difficult to deliver. But I think if you're looking at competitiveness and flexibility, we're already moving very substantially in those directions. That's why I'm rather an optimist. And just to comment about some of the things Petros was saying, I mean, I don't think we're talking about having no regulation or no unanimity. You know, there are some areas like banking union where the UK is absolutely adamant that things have to be decided at 28 because we don't want the Eurozone to be able to create a special club for itself. But some of the things that the Business Task Force have been advocating, they have this list of principles which very conveniently spell the word compete. And it's things like, if you're introducing new regulation, is it competitive? Can you measure the impact? Is it proportional? Can you evaluate what's happening? One of the things that the Business Task Force have complained about, for example, are new ideas in Europe to try and regulate on how you can get young people back into work. And there's some ideas going around about how we could have a huge European system, which is a one-size-fits-all. Now, in the UK, we have a lot of quite informal programmes about how to get people back into work, and some of them are rather short-term secondments to businesses and apprenticeships. And we're just worried that we don't want some of that rather flexible work that's going on in the UK to be hamstrung by new regulation from Brussels, which just seems rather unnecessary. So I think, again, it's a rather British common sense approach, and I think it is a realistic one.
Øivind, if the Britons would like to renegotiate, wouldn't that also give an incentive for the Germans and the French and all the others who are not totally satisfied with the way EU works today?
It's a very interesting question, and I think it plays along the lines of a very long British tradition about suggesting what Europe could do while remaining detached from it. You may be familiar with Winston Churchill's famous Zurich speech, where he talked about the suggested United States of Europe, that Europe needed to integrate. This was just before 1950, and the footnote to all that was that Britain, of course, was not to take part in that federal project in a way. And you see sort of you see the echo of this in today's assumption that the Eurozone will need to go further in terms of integration, while Britain and other non-Euro states could remain more detached from that, from those supranational federalist ambitions in a way. And this would mean that you get an inner core of the Eurozone countries, and on the one hand, and then outer margin of more detached member states on the other hand, of which Britain would be a prominent member. And these would be more oriented towards the free trade and cultivate the inner market, while they would refrain from some of the other policy areas involved. And certainly they would be detached from the attempts to integrate currency and banking issues even further. So that is really part, I mean, the issue of renegotiation is really based on the assumption that the core of Europe needs to go further. That's at least an argument you hear very often. This would mean, of course, that David Cameron is also detached from the Franco-German partnership. And that is another thorny side to this as well, that in order to fight among equals, you would like to be there around the table with them. And that is one of the dilemmas, I think.
Petros?
I agree with Jane. There are a lot of people within the European Union that share quite a lot of what Mr. Cameron is standing for, not least the Dutch. But it's interesting to see what the Dutch Prime Minister said at the end of the last summit a couple of weeks ago. He said that we want reform, but we want it done within the existing treaties and without national opt-outs, because we don't want to disrupt the single market. And he continued, there are overlaps in the UK position and our position, as well as the Commission's refit process. But the UK want opt-outs that we do not want. We want decisions by 28 member states that apply to 28 member states. That's the Dutch Prime Minister, one of Mr. Cameron's closest friends. And this is where the problem lies for Mr. Cameron. Rhetoric can go a long way, but reality catches up with you eventually. And to address one more thing that Jane said, it is true that Britain is committed to having measures at the 28 level on a variety of areas, including financial services. Not everybody in the European Union is as keen on the areas that the UK is keen, but they have to compromise because they expect to get consensus from the UK in other areas. It is very dangerous negotiating position to go into a room and say, I am very keen on this, and I want you all to sign up, but I'm going to totally ignore what you are interested in, and I'm going to get an opt-out from that. What stops them from saying, fair enough, we're going to get an opt-out from something that is important to you? I mean, the French spend a lot of their time disagreeing with the Brits in the European Council, and they're looking for an opportunity to opt out from things as well.
I can see we're already starting to run out of time. We have 6 more people have tried to come on the speakers list. I will try to make sure that everybody gets time, but I can't promise it because we will end before 9:30. First is Las Pedro, and afterwards I also noticed Claire wanting to come on the speakers list. Las Pedros. So please continue to be brief and concrete.
Always difficult to be brief, but it's all interesting and refreshing to have a debate on the EU. In this country is a very seldom thing, and then typically it's about not Norwegians and Norway with the EU, it's about Britain and the EU. But I think one narrative of the big problem in Europe is serious lack of economic dynamism, which is creating heavy unemployment, stagnating economies, and a lot of other problems. Part of that narrative might be also be that the best thing about Europe historically has been a certain liberalizing Europe, and a decentralized Europe, and also a Europe of a certain competition of institutions. So institutions can compete and become better in a liberal evolution. So, and in this debate, there is the liberalizing forces, the open market, and there is the corporatist centralizing forces of an ever deeper or closer union, which is absolute, I think, must be understood as a direction towards more centralization of powers in Brussels. And there is possibly a good balancing point. But I would like to pose a challenge to you. Don't you agree that we probably have met some very clear limits of centralizing of powers to Brussels in the Europe, that we have to move more in the direction of the liberalizing forces, and in fact more along the lines of the ambassador was saying.
Thank you. So to sum up the question, has Brussels gotten too much power? Is it too much centralizing? I would assume that you agree with that, Ambassador?
Yeah, I think so. And you know, the UK does have an agreement that if there is a further proposal on the table to transfer more power to Brussels, we would definitely have a referendum on that subject. So I think for the UK, we've kind of met the limit of that, and we do think there's a great deal of scope for introducing more competitiveness into what the EU does today.
Petros, what's your view? Is it too much power to Brussels? Is EU too centralized?
If you look at all the important elements of governance, healthcare, education, defense, all these have remained within the domain of the nation state. They haven't moved up to the European level at all. These are the expensive items of the budget, which is why member states spend 1% of their budget to the EU, and in many cases, like Britain, 40% on defense. So you can understand where the balance is, and I don't think we have gone too far in centralization because the big items remain decentralized. What the EU does is bring 28 nations together to find common ground in the areas that are important. And last week, the European Union, the UK, hosted an article from the director of Friends of the Earth, a leading environmental NGO, and she argued against this cutting red tape initiative. Because according to a lot of people, Brussels has done a great job in regulating consumer protection, environmental protection, product protection. You know, the toys that our children play with are safer because we have common standards in the EU which are applied globally for anybody who wants to export into the EU. So a lot of people don't want to see watering down of those regulations, which are expensive, by the way, for companies. I accept that. You know, making sure that the bread you sell is healthy is a bit expensive, and making sure that the water you bottle is appropriate for drinking is a bit expensive. But I'm relaxed with that kind of regulation. I think it's important. It's actually the input that the European Union makes to the lives of people. So I wouldn't like to see deregulation for the sake of it.
Øivind, I don't know if you have an opinion about whether or not Brussels has gotten too much power.
I'll save that comment and I wait for more questions.
Sure. Claire, please.
Claire Fox from the Institute of Ideas of the UK. I just happen to be in Oslo, so really to ask you all if you have any reflections on the generational split. There's a caricature, I think, that young British people are pro-Europe and it's kind of old fogies who are anti. That's not what I find working with young people. A lot of young people, it seems to me, in Britain are pro-European, anti-EU, and are quite sceptical, not for the old reasons, and partly because they're very distrustful of political elites that seem very far removed from them, both in Britain itself, but in Europe as well, because they have friends in Eurozone countries where they've seen the damages being done to Athens, it's not a happy story, and it's not a democracy if you happen to be in Greece or Portugal and you're being dictated to by Merkel. So it's not that straightforward. The other question is really about the voice of the people, which even in this discussion has been treated with a certain amount of contempt, possibly. There is a danger in the UK context, I think, of talking about people who are Eurosceptical as though they're kind of right-wing backwoodsmen who are kind of anti-immigration, racist, Little Englanders. And the more that the elites do that, the more that they are guaranteeing that people will be anti-EU. Because the vast majority of people are rightly sceptical of losing their democratic powers, are nervous about mass immigration, although I don't agree with them on that. They're nervous about it, but that doesn't mean that they're racist, and have to be treated with some respect, not contempt. And I would say trust the people, and I think the issue of the referendum, if people say no, we don't want one because we don't know how they'll vote, I can tell you, you won't just be dealing with the referendum, hopefully you'll be dealing with a better kicking from the people than that. I think you have to bear in mind it's actually more complicated, and the British people are not the caricature that sometimes they're described to be. They're all sorts of different political needs.
Thank you. So I registered 2 questions. First about the generation split. Who are, is it the older, the younger, who are most opposed to EU? And the second was a comment about the voice of the people and the need for the elites to treat them with respect, not contempt. So if I start with you, Petros, I'm not calling you an elitist, but you certainly could be recognized as one.
My mother would be so proud. First, I'll start with Greece, and probably you guessed from my accent and my name that I'm not British. And that doesn't mean that there are no British pro-Europeans left. I think the only reason they made me chairman is I look good on radio. So I want to say that, speaking of caricatures, the impression that Merkel somehow has cancelled out democracy in Greece and it's making the Greek people do things they don't want is unfair. Germany, as well as the other partners of Greece, have invested considerably in keeping the country afloat. If nothing else, it's our own politicians that inflicted our current predicament upon us. And through the help of our European partners, we're going through a process of massive reform that is desperately needed and long overdue in Greece. I'll agree with you on the economics. If I was the head of the IMF, I would have prescribed the kind of fast and painful remedy that they have prescribed upon Greece. I would have done it differently. But that doesn't cancel out democracy. You know, we elected the government that is currently in place. You know, we actually had 2 elections to manage to get the government in place. And people are committed to that process of reform that is taking place thanks to the European Union. If it wasn't for the European Union, if it wasn't for the Eurozone, I don't know where Greece will be right now. But just to answer your question very, very quickly, I do agree that a lot of people, young people, are anti-establishment. And Jane mentioned the rate of approval of the European Union, which is indeed low, but in many cases higher than the rate of approval of national governments. Because indeed, over the last few years, politicians have found wanted. They have been unable to deal with some very pressing issues, not least the issue of employment for the younger generations who are preparing themselves for a lifetime on the dole. So we forget that the EU is just a collection of member states. The same politicians that sit in the parliament here or in the parliament in London are the guys that go over in Brussels and the girls that go over in Brussels and they decide things. So yeah, there is a sentiment of anti-establishment, but not an anti-EU as such. People are concerned that the politicians are not doing their job properly, and I think that's something that political elites across the continent need to address.
Øivind, the first question, who are most EU skeptics? Is it the younger generation, the older generation?
There's a great mix of different concerns here, and also there's the elephant in the room here, which is UKIP and the kind of right-wing populism that is opposed to the EU. But if I may just address the previous question, I would like to just very quickly follow up on what Lars Peter said, even though I neglected answering it in the first place. I think your view on this, it may be slightly misleading to portray the sort of basic cleavage about Europe's future as either being dynamic, forward-looking, deregulated on the one hand, or kind of corporatist, over-regulated, backward-looking on the other hand. Because this may, I think it's reminiscent of the famous Margaret Thatcher quote from that speech that we have not rolled back the frontiers of the state only to see them reimposed in Brussels by a European superstate. This is a heavily political or politicized view, which points to the kind of the deregulated, conservative British business model as superior to the European one. But that is not what the basic choice is about. I mean, there are multiple choices about Europe's future. There is a Scandinavian model to be thrown into that debate as well. And I think that the future, at least one perspective on this, would be that the future would lie in high-skilled, export-oriented, high-quality products from Europe, not trying to race down towards the bottom, or getting closer to the bottom. I've heard this argument that there's no one in China caring about the Working Times Directive, for example. Well, maybe it's not the point that you would like to compete with those in China who do not subscribe to Working Times Directive. Maybe the idea of Europe should be to work towards being a vanguard in the world economy, making better products in a better quality way for workers and for all parties involved. So it's a bit more, I think there is a nuance to this, which also suggests that not all European regulation is reactionary or heavy-handed or counterproductive in a way.
Ambassador Owen, any quick comments before we take the last question?
Yeah, well, I think you're dead right that we have to take the people seriously, and I was being rather flippant saying that democracy is inconvenient. You can't ignore what the people want, and I think that's exactly right. That we are looking at having a referendum to give people a voice. I agree it's quite complicated when you look at the differences between young and old people, and I think that, or older people. And I think one of the main issues is that people feel they have a lack of information. The government hasn't given them sufficient information about how much does it really cost to join the European Union or to be a member of the European Union. Once you've taken into account the money you pay, the rebates you get, the other benefits you get, how much does it really cost? And there has been some work to look at this, and I think the Treasury came out with a figure of around £145 a head or something in the UK, which is actually probably relatively good value for money. And if people knew these kind of things and had this kind of information, things would be much clearer. And finally, I do agree, it does come down to the economics of it. I think that's going to be tremendously important. When the Eurozone is looking at how it manages the banking system in Europe, we have to make sure that this does not have a detrimental effect on the City of London, because the city is Europe's main financial centre, and if that is damaged, this is going to be very good news for New York and Singapore. It's not going to be good news for anyone else inside the Union, and we have to get these kind of issues right and be clear about where our collective best interest lies.
Last question from the audience is the man. Please be brief, we're running out of time.
A quick analogy, coming from the United States, it's very interesting to see the EU debate. Many people forget that the US has 50 member states and Washington, D.C., and 200 years later, the debate still goes on within the US all the time. So that being said, and nobody in the US is advocating going back to 50 individual countries or states. But my analogy is the UK has a long history of dealing with its Commonwealth partners and embracing and dealing with, and at the same time pushing away slightly the EU neighbors. Is there any political analogy or similarities or differences going on with its dealing with its Commonwealth partners and neighbors versus the EU? Because the Commonwealth is a diverse group of geographic entities and nation states as well. And that's my question.
Yes, so then we take that question, and all the panelists get a chance to have a summary if they want to. And again, be brief, we're running out of time, so I start with you, Petros, then Øivind, and then Ambassador Owen last. Petros.
I have to admit that people in the audience have been much better than I have in being brief, so I will try to keep it short and also offer a conclusion. The US example, it is indeed an interesting one, because there was a significant civil war that took place when the formation of the Union was fought for. And in many ways it's something that we have escaped. The EU is an agent of peace and democracy, and we keep forgetting it because we have moved on. My generation and the generation after me hasn't really experienced a European-wide war. So it's important to remind ourselves what was the real reason why the European Union was constructed, and what are the very tangible benefits that it offers. So I just want to give the opportunity to everybody else to talk as much as I have and leave you with that thought. Europe is the personification of peace and democracy, and we have to do whatever is possible to maintain.
Amen.
Just very briefly to our American friend here, I think there's a basic distinction to be drawn between Britain and France in this respect, and a distinction that appeared immediately after the Second World War, where France made a strategic choice to project its national interest through Europe, and its colonial interest to be promoted through Europe as well. Whereas Britain preferred what Churchill referred to as the three circles, whereby Europe, the Commonwealth, and the Atlantic community would be three concurrent strategies to pursue. And I think it's difficult to liberate oneself from that idea, and perhaps it's not so necessary after all. If you insist on a special relationship, it's worthwhile nurturing that particularity. And when it comes to the Commonwealth, there are, even though there's mostly ceremonial remains from what was the Commonwealth before, there's also some utility in maintaining close relations. One example is India, whereby the historical relationship has enabled a closer trade relationship today. So I think the three-track or the three-circle strategy is something that is still viable, and it's one of the reasons why Britain has always been concerned not to be too closely entangled in Europe.
Ambassador Owen, your last comment?
Yeah, I think the Commonwealth is just so different from our relationship with the EU. It's extremely important, but it's a much looser gathering, isn't it? And I think that the UK still really suffers from this image that we are kind of on the margins and not very engaged with Europe. You know, when you work in the British government, I can tell you, we've got hundreds of people in Brussels, and ministers are going there constantly. We have this huge programme of interaction among the ministers to prepare our positions. And I think the reason why many member states want us to stay a member is that they know that we are one of the top driving forces for almost everything that goes on in Europe, and they don't want to lose that. So I think we are already incredibly engaged. And just to add a few final comments, I think there's three things that we're likely to see going forward. One is this constant and consistent commitment to democracy, flexibility and competitiveness. That will not change. We will, however, see much more debate and much more information coming out in the UK over the next year or so. So do look out for that, because that will be significant, and I think we will therefore see this debate evolving greatly over the next couple of years as this information comes out. So you will see the debate evolving in the UK, and it will be also very significant to see how the discussions evolve with our member state partners within Europe, because that, of course, will determine what the new normal will look like in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll end in just about 20 seconds, and we can give them a hand. My apologies to the ones who didn't make it on the speakers list due to time restrictions. Next week we have Bill Gates coming here. Unfortunately, the event is fully booked, but you can watch it online on civita.no. And also please register on our newsletter, and you can get many invitations, for example, like the ones of Bill Gates. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience. Have a great weekend.